Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. And you may not have taken notice of this, and maybe because of all the other things we have going on with the armed forces around the world, maybe it wasn't something we should take notice of. But back in March, there was a change, actually a new set of Army rules regarding tattoos, hairstyles, grooming, and uniforms for soldiers. And one of the new regulations banned women from having twists, dreadlocks, and multiple braids, cornrows that are bigger than a quarter of an inch. Black service members quickly spoke out about the rules, arguing that they were racially insensitive, and objected to language that called such styles quote-unquote matted and quote-unquote unkempt. So they said these new changes were racially biased and the lack of regard for ethnic hair is apparent. With us this morning, the guy who deals with the military law is Brian Bouffard, and he joins us here on the Gary Sutton Show. He is an attorney. And good morning, Brian. Great to have you back on the show.
Hey, good morning, Gary. Thanks for having me.
Brian, I know amidst everything else that's going on around the world with the military, this seems kind of trivial, and yet at the same time, morale is important in any kind of Army unit, no matter what you're talking about, and this certainly is one that makes morale a little bit tougher. What were your thoughts about this and these new rules?
The new rules don't bother me a bit. I mean, when you hear on the news, talking about dreadlocks, don't think of Bob Marley. I mean, these aren't, huge dreadlocks like you would see in a situation like that. These are generally conservative hairstyles, and the fact that the Army has changed the rules is just that they've realized that African hair does grow differently than Caucasian hair. It just does.
And that was not, though, the original intent there, it looks like, when they said unkempt and matted down. And, of course, it was challenged by a number of people. And Secretary Hagel came out of the Defense Department, and they came out and reviewed the hairstyles and basically said the guidelines seemed to be a little bit discriminatory. And so, and it said that targeted soldiers who are women of color with little regard to what is needed to maintain their natural hair. So right. At his direction, each of the military services reviewed it, and I guess they came out with a little bit a more sane kind of thing now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the slightest problem with this move. I think, like you said, morale is important, and if there's something we can do to increase morale and not cause any detriment to the readiness of our force, I say do it.
The changes made by the military to its grooming guidelines, as outlined in Hagel's letter last Tuesday, determined that the terms matted and unkempt or offensive will eliminate those. Authorize temporary two-trans twists, increase the size of authorized braids, cornrows, and twists, remove spacing requirement, authorize the ponytail during physical training. That was for the Army, and I guess the Air Force did the same kind of things, changed the name dreadlocks to locks.
Right.
Does some of this seem to be kind of more just a semantic change than anything else?
Well, I mean, it could be, but the bottom line is that there were legitimate hairstyles that certain soldiers were trying to use, and it looks just fine in the uniform. I mean, there's no issues there. So, again, I think this is a smart call. It doesn't cost anyone anything, and it increases morale.
What are the things that when you look at morale right now and you deal with that on a regular basis, I wonder what the morale is of our Army right now. I'm taking it out to another level here, but as we look at our Army and we look at what's happening in Iraq and other places around the world where we've left and so forth, I just wonder if we're asking our Army to do too much anymore beyond just being soldiers.
Well, we are. I mean, we're asking our armed forces to do a ton these days, and I think that really has its genesis in the political will to project our force, wherever in the world we want to, without regard for our interests truly at stake. So, I know that our heavy deployment cycle is, it's the kind of thing that can tend to bring down morale. So hopefully, when they're looking at issues like different hairstyles and which words to parse out, I hope they give some thought to should we be in certain conflicts at all in the first place.
One of the things that we've seen recently, Brian, and I don't know if this has touched into your area yet or not, was the firing of a number of people when they get home who were still in positions of combat and still in service in places like Afghanistan. And we seem to be paring down our forces right now, and they say, well, a smaller, more adaptable force is going to be necessary for the future. But as we look at the number of theaters of potential action around the world right now, many of us who are the uninitiated ask, geez, is that really the case, or should we have a larger Army on standby here in case we have more of these kinds of problems we've seen?
Well, I think those are both good questions, and they're political questions. In other words, we elect our leaders to hopefully make good judgments on questions like that. I can say that the fact that we're dealing with this huge drawdown, particularly in the junior officer ranks and the junior enlisted ranks, to me that's a failure of planning in the first place. And if we recruit somebody, we ought to allow them, if they conduct themselves honorably, in my opinion, we ought to allow them to continue to serve.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at, and I guess that's what I was leading around to, that we always say thank you to our soldiers and thank you to our servicemen, and that never seems to even be enough. And yet here's an administration, and so many other administrations too, but this administration dealing with this right now says thank you, but meanwhile they're knocking people out of there through the Defense Department. Nice to know that when you're coming home, you don't have a job anymore. You've just spent how many tours overseas? You talked about the number of tours that we've had with a lot of soldiers, and to me, it's just a slap in the face to our soldiers who are serving and our military people who are serving overseas and elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I think it would be not entirely accurate to blame all of that on the current administration, because it was the last administration that gave us the ridiculous sequester.
And that's why I said I'm not putting it. This is not a political thing. I'm putting it. Wherever that blame falls, it falls. That's the way it goes. But yeah, I just don't understand why that's going around. Are there other things out there? You and I talked some time ago about Bo Bergdahl. Is there anything happening on that front right now with Bo Bergdahl? I mean, with the story, the crisis du jour happening literally every day, that story got lost somewhere in the files, but wonder if you had any information on where that stands right now.
Yeah, it kind of did percolate out a little bit. But yeah, my understanding is that the investigation is now completed. He's writing up his report. When I say he, I mean the investigating officer. He's writing up his report. That's going to be submitted to his higher authority. And at some point, after that is digested by the senior leadership, there's going to be a decision made of whether or not to refer charges against Sergeant Bergdahl. So that's going to be the next possible step here, is the decision to prosecute or not prosecute.
Do you think they've handled it well so far as Sergeant Bergdahl's been concerned?
Depends on who you mean by they.
They being the armed forces, and I would say the man behind the curtain, maybe the administration on this. But do you think they've handled it well?
From what I can see from my admittedly very limited vantage point, I think the Army has handled it quite well. I don't know that I would say the same for the civilian leadership. You're thinking in particular about Susan Rice's comments. That doesn't help anything. It's not accurate. It's just going to inflame people. I mean, this is obviously a very serious incident, and a lot of high feelings on both sides of it. And I think the Army, again, from what I can tell, I think the Army has done a pretty good job of managing that so far. I mean, they're going through the steps they need to go through. He doesn't appear to be getting any kind of special treatment. It's just kind of being handled by the book.
I guess if you could somehow, when you look at military tribunals and so forth, and the kind of things you get involved in, I guess somehow you could say if there is a way of making a guy be innocent until proven guilty, the Army's done a pretty good job in that regard.
I think so. I really do. The real evidence in this case, like I've been saying all along, the real evidence in this case comes from the mouths of his platoon mates and the folks who were out there with him in that combat outpost in 2009. Those are the people who were interviewed back then. My understanding is that they've been interviewed again now, and if he's prosecuted, they're going to be the centerpiece of the government's case.
Now, here's a question for you. We understand that eventually he's going to want to, fairly short period of time, want to get out of the Army. So now they've interviewed him. They're going through the whole process that's laid out there. I'm assuming that. And so let's suppose at some point in time he wants to leave the Army. Is he still prosecutable, if there is such a word?
In theory, yes. They could let him out and recall him to active duty. But normally that's for a situation in which a crime is discovered after someone is already off active duty.
Right.
The fact of the matter here is that until the decision is firmly made not to prosecute him, he's going to remain in the Army.
Right.
Even if he reaches his end of service date, they're going to put him on legal hold and keep him in, either to prosecute him or while they're still trying to decide whether to prosecute him.
We're talking with Brian Bouffard this morning, who is an attorney and an expert in military law. When you look at the case of a Bo Bergdahl, obviously that's simmered down now with everything else that's going around the world, and we look at what happens down the road here for this guy? You know, if you can lay it out just roughly for us. Let's suppose he goes through this whole thing. Let's suppose that he's found not guilty. That's the easy out. Obviously, there'll be some reaction around the country about that, I'm sure, and about from his comrades. But let's suppose that he's found guilty, or let's suppose that they say, okay, there's some stuff here that needs to go on. What's the step-by-step process by which he eventually will get to, I'm assuming, a military tribunal?
Well, yeah, and then we've got to unpack a lot of your question. Now, he's not going to face any kind of a quote-unquote tribunal in terms of like what's going on in Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
He would be facing a court-martial.
That's what I was really trying to say. Forgive my inartfulness.
That's okay. Yeah, and a lot of people use words like that interchangeably, but just to be clear, it would be a court-martial, and a court-martial is the disciplinary court system for service members who are accused of crimes, okay, as opposed to, say, enemy combatants or somebody like that. So, you know, again, if he were convicted, I mean, we're talking way down the road, and a lot of decisions
I understand
haven't even been made yet. But, you know, if he's convicted, the first thing that happens is they roll right into a sentencing case in which both sides attempt to argue to either the judge or the court members what would be an appropriate sentence. So, I mean, certainly the government would bring up the folks who went out looking for Bergdahl, the injuries and deaths that occurred because of his decision to absent himself. That's certainly very aggravating. The defense, on the other hand, is going to bring up the fact that he's already served 5 years, not in a sane and safe place of confinement like Fort Leavenworth, but in the hands of a very ugly enemy.
So you look at the whole thing and you say, all right, maybe he left his post. Now, one of the biggest questions out there is, did he leave his post and go to join this group? Did he leave his post and he somehow wander off and they picked him up and he would brainwash him down the line? I guess there's a lot of different complicating factors in that whole thing, right?
Absolutely. If they can show that he had the intent of joining the enemy and actually did, they may very well bury him under the jail. He'll be in there so long. On the other hand, if he was, you know, just acting foolishly, he left, he got captured, even though it was kind of foreseeable that might happen, but he didn't really intend to and he didn't help them, then I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, even if down the road he got a conviction, I wouldn't be surprised if his sentence did not include any confinement at all. They can say, well, you've already had your pound of flesh that's been lost.
And basically, you can't court-martial someone for innate stupidity, right?
Well, you can.
Okay.
I've seen it all. I've seen it a lot.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just saying. I mean, to say, okay, I wandered off there, and you know, I headed on out, and you know, I was collecting flowers and butterflies and balloons, and geez, I got caught. That you know, that's not the smartest thing for any soldier, and yet. And of course, we've heard a lot of things from those soldiers informally, but not in that legal setting that you have to have for all this. So, but I was really making a joke. I didn't realize you get something for innate stupidity.
Well, when you get right down to it, you know, when a law is broken, you're probably looking at either stupidity or evil. And I can tell you, after doing this for many, many years, it's vastly just stupidity. It's not very often that it's just abject evil, and that's why. You know, that's why in this case it's going to be so important for the jury, for the court members to try to figure out what they believe was in Bo Bergdahl's mind.
Yep, and that's going to be an interesting, long process here. Hey, Brian, always appreciate you being on with us. Thanks so much. I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to be right here.
Anytime, Gary. Take care.
Take care. Brian Bouffard with us here on the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA.